During the Cold War, Finland was neutral. They were worried about their powerful neighbour to the east, the Soviet Union, and their priority was maintaining their independence and not antagonising the Soviet Union. Urho Kekkonen and Juho Kusti Paasikivi, who were the two presidents who dominated Finnish politics in the 50s, 60s and 70s, they came up with a doctrine known as the Paasikivi-Kekkonen doctrine. This is essentially what Finlandisation was. It ensured that Finland would remain independent as long as they remained within certain parameters. They ensured good relations with both the West and the Soviet Union. Their priority was never antagonizing the Soviet Union. They bought weapons from both. They bought T-72s, MiG-21s, and of course they never even considered joining either NATO or the European Union. The reason they didn't join the European Union was because of the common foreign policy. They felt that would compromise their neutrality and possibly antagonize the Soviet Union. This type of situation is not unusual. Think of the Republic of Ireland during the Cold War, whether they would have been able to ally themselves with the Soviet Union, or what would have happened if they had decided to do that. Would the United Kingdom have invaded them, for example? Similar situation in North America with Canada and Mexico. Would those countries have been able to, if they had so wished, to join an alliance with the Soviet Union? Would the United States have allowed that to happen? An even better example is the current situation in Taiwan, where you essentially have two political camps. One camp wants to move towards independence and is not really concerned about antagonizing China. The other group is very concerned about that. They want to maintain the status quo because they know that the reality of moving away from China towards independence could be dangerous and could result in invasion or possibly war. A similar situation existed in Ukraine in the 90s and the 2000s. There are essentially two camps, two political coalitions. Now, I'm simplifying things here. There's a lot of issues and not everyone in these coalitions agrees with all these issues, but essentially there are two camps. Let's call the first camp the Orange Camp, the pro-Western camp. These guys want to see Ukraine move away from Russia towards the EU. They want to see them joining NATO. In terms of language, they want to see the Ukrainian language prioritized, and they don't want official status for the Russian language. There's also issues in terms of religion. There are two Orthodox Christian churches in Ukraine, one which is allied to or under the authority of the Patriarch of Kiev, and another which is under the authority of the Patriarch of Moscow. Now, the Orange Camp wants to see the Russian affiliated Orthodox Church suppressed. The Blue Camp, now this is sometimes called the pro-Russian camp. I think this is maybe a bit misleading. I think they're more pro-status quo than anything else. Now they're not so much wary about joining the EU, but they're concerned that they only want to join the EU if it's not going to affect their trade with Russia. And that's a problem. If they join Russia, it may invalidate their trade agreements or free trade with Russia, which is very important. So that's their concern about the EU. They're totally opposed to joining NATO because they know that's going to antagonize Russia. A lot of ethnic Russians in the East, a lot of Russian speakers, they're totally opposed to joining NATO. In terms of language, they want equal status for the Russian language, or at least official status, and they want autonomy for the eastern regions. Whereas the Orange Camp tends to be opposed to that. Another issue is the military base at Sevastopol, the Russian military base in the Crimea. The Orange Camp, Russia leases this from Ukraine in a long-term deal, and the lease for this base was up in 2017. The Orange Camp did not want to renew that lease, whereas the Blue Camp, let's say the pro-Russian camp or the pro-status quo camp, they do want that lease to be extended. In 2004, the Orange Coalition won the presidency. Viktor Yushchenko won, and Yanukovych was defeated. In 2008, you had for the first time an attempt maybe to move away from this Finlandization situation in Ukraine. There was the first serious attempt to join NATO. Here's a cable from William Burns, who is currently the director of the CIA. In 2008, he was the American ambassador to Ukraine. And here's what he had to say about the idea of Ukraine joining NATO. These are from WikiLeaks. Russia would view further eastward expansion as a potential military threat. In Ukraine, these include fears that the issue could potentially split the country in two, leading to violence or even some claim civil war, which would force Russia to decide whether to intervene. So this is what Russia is afraid of. Russia is afraid that it could lead to civil war in Ukraine. He talks about Ukraine's NATO aspirations touching a raw nerve in Russia. Russia is particularly worried that the strong divisions in Ukraine over NATO membership, with much of the ethnic Russian community against membership, could lead to a major split involving violence or at worst civil war. In that eventuality, Russia would have to decide whether to intervene, a decision Russia does not want to have to face. This is the most potentially destabilizing factor in US-Russian relations. Now, I think there's two things that's interesting here. First of all, the Americans are under no illusions as to how serious an issue this is for Russia. And secondly, it's clear that the Americans understand that if Russia intervenes, it's purely for security reasons. Russia does not want to intervene. They do not want to invade. They do not have territorial aspirations in Ukraine. If they do invade, if they do intervene, it's only for reasons of security. Now, this contrasts quite strongly with the public messaging that we're getting in 2023 from the Americans, when a lot of energy is being spent dismissing the idea that the war is about NATO. And a lot of energy has been spent trying to convince the Western public that Russia is actually involved in Ukraine because they want to gain territory, and that the narrative coming from Russia about it being primarily about NATO, that's false. Yet it's clear that in 2008, at least, the Americans did understand that any potential conflict would be about NATO. Ukraine's attempt to join NATO in 2008 was eventually shot down. The Americans were keen on it. The continental Europeans were not. Merkel, Sarkozy, the Italians, the Spanish, they've always been more wary about this. The idea of Ukraine joining NATO, it's always been something which has been pushed primarily by America and to a lesser extent Britain, not the continental Europeans. Now, in 2010, the pro-Russian side, or the pro-status quo side, won. They got into power. They won the presidency. Yanukovych defeated Yulia Tymoshenko. Between 2010 and late 2013, Yanukovych dropped the idea completely of Ukraine joining NATO. The lease for the Russian naval base at Sevastopol, that was extended for 25 years from 2017 to 2042. That was very controversial. The Orange camp did not like that at all. And finally, Yanukovych, he kept dragging his feet and postponing signing the Free Trade Association Agreement with the EU. It was this final postponing and dragging his feet regarding the EU agreement that is what ultimately undid Yanukovych, and it's what led to the Maidan revolution. That was what really angered the Ukrainian population. So in early 2014, you had the Maidan revolution and Yanukovych was overthrown. The Russians at this stage intervened. They sent troops into Crimea, which was primarily to secure the naval base there. They never wanted to have to go through that situation again. They never wanted to have to worry about losing Sevastopol again and potentially it becoming a NATO base or an American base. That's why the Russians went into Crimea and they annexed Crimea. It was because it was vital for their strategic security. The Russians also became involved in eastern Ukraine and the Donbass. Now, their motivations and their strategic objectives here were different. They didn't want to take over this territory. Their objective here was to give themselves influence over Ukrainian politics by having that region under the control of their proxies. Another issue for the Russians was they thought, not unreasonably, that NATO wouldn't touch Ukraine with a barge pole as long as there was a frozen conflict within their borders. Now, this situation persisted between 2014 to 2021. Now, in 2021, the tensions started to rise again. The Russians built up their military forces on the border with Ukraine. This was partly in response to a large NATO exercise which involved Ukraine called Defender Europe. It was also partly in response to increased naval activity by NATO countries in the Black Sea, and also partly in response to a comment by Zelensky that he would take back Crimea, possibly by force. In June 2021 at the Brussels conference, NATO reiterated that Ukraine would become a member. They had said things like this before between 2008 and 2021, but the language they used here was slightly stronger. And considering the tensions surrounding Ukraine at the time, it was quite provocative towards Russia. Reiterate the decision made at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine will become a member of the alliance. We stand firm in our support for Ukraine's right to decide its own future and foreign policy course free from outside interference, which is an obvious reference to Russia and their protests about Ukraine potentially joining NATO. In late 2021, there was a second Russian military build-up on the border. This time it was much larger. This was happening around November. The Russians sent a document, a draft treaty to NATO requesting 3 security guarantees, basically. They wanted a guarantee that NATO wouldn't expand any further eastward, including and especially Ukraine. They wanted a guarantee that foreign military forces would move out of NATO countries that had joined after 1997. This is basically a reference to Eastern Europe, the countries in green here. The Russians wanted US military bases out of those countries that had joined NATO after 1997. The third request they had was for limits placed on the location of intermediate range missiles. The Russian requests were not met. The Russians were not happy about this. This is happening late 2021, early 2022, with this massive Russian military force on the border. While this is going on, the Minsk Accords, which were supposed to solve the situation in the Donbass, the Ukrainian side was not implementing these. The Russians finally, they were exasperated, and on February 22nd, they effectively withdrew from the Minsk agreement, and they recognized the independence of Donetsk and Lugansk. The Russians at this stage were exasperated. They felt that their policy of Finlandization and that they'd tried to pursue and encourage in Ukraine lay in tatters, that the next effort that they had made to try and keep Ukraine out of NATO, which was their intervention in the Donbass, that didn't seem to have worked either. The Minsk Accords were being broken. They weren't receiving the security guarantees that they'd requested from the West. At this stage, the Russians, exasperated, took the decision that they needed to invade in order to protect their own security. This is what happened 2 days later. Russia invaded, the war began, and we are in the current situation that we find ourselves.